Hello, welcome back to Boring Fantasy for Sleep. Tonight is episode 4 of The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. In episode 3, three things happened. A troll named Lurelu crossed the border from Elfland into the fields we know, drawn by the smell of smoke and cooking, and found the ordinary world extraordinary. The Elf King wrote a rune in the old script of Elfland out of love for his daughter, and Lyrazel read it, and she blew away, and then Elfland retreated. The border that had always been no more than 20 or 25 miles from the village of Earl moved east and kept moving and did not stop. The pale blue mountains drew back from the horizon. The golden air withdrew. The plain left behind was grey and flat and ordinary, as though it had never been otherwise. Alveric is alone. Orion is very young, and the place Alveric would go to find what he has lost is no longer where it was. Tonight, the dark years begin, and something stirs in Alveric that will not be quieted. This is episode 4, The Unenchanted Plain. Chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13.
Chapter 10. The Ebbing of Elfland. Next morning, Alveric came up the tower to the witch Zirundaril, weary and frantic from searching all night long in strange places for Lyrazel. All night he had tried to guess what fancy had beckoned her out, and whither it might have led her. He had searched by the stream by which she had prayed to the stones, and the pool where she prayed to the stars. He had called her name up every tower, and had called it wide in the dark, and had had no answer but echo. And so he had come at last to the witch Zirundaril. "Whither?" he said, saying no more than that the boy might not know his fears. Yet Orion knew, and Zirundaril all mournfully shook her head. "The way of the leaves," she said, "the way of all beauty." But Alveric did not stay to hear her say more than her first 5 words, for he went with the restlessness with which he had come, straight from the room and hastily down the stair, and out at once into the windy morning to see which way those glorious leaves were gone. And a few leaves that had clung to cold branches longer, when the gay company of their comrades had gone, were now 2 on the air, going lonely and last. And Alveric saw they were going southeast towards Elfland. Hurriedly, then he donned his magical sword in its wide scabbard of leather, and with scanty provisions hastened over the fields, after the last of the leaves whose autumnal glory led him, as many a cause in its latter days, all splendid and fallen, leads all manner of men. And so he came to the upland fields, with their grass all grey with dew, and the air was all sparkling with sunlight, and gay with the last of the leaves. But a melancholy seemed to dwell with the sound of the lowing of cattle, in the calm, bright morning, with the northwest wind roaming through it. Alveric came by no calm, and never gave up the haste of one who has lost something suddenly. He had the swift movements of such, and the frantic air. He watched all day over clear, wide horizons, southeast where the leaves were leading, and at evening he looked to see the elfin mountains, severe and changeless, unlit by any light we know, the colour of pale forget-me-nots. He held on restlessly to see their summits, but never they came to view. And then he saw the house of the old leather worker who had made the scabbard for his sword, and the sight of it brought back to him the years that were gone since the evening when first he had seen it, although he never knew how many they were, and could not know, for no one has ever devised any exact calculation whereby to estimate the action of time in Elfland. Then he looked once more for the pale blue elfin mountains, remembering well where they lay, in their long grave row past a point of one of the leather workers' gables. But he saw never a line of them. Then he entered the house, and the old man still was. There, the leather worker was wonderfully aged. Even the table on which he worked was much older. He greeted Alveric, remembering who he was, and Alveric inquired for the old man's wife. "She died long ago," he said. And again, Alveric felt the baffling flight of those years, which added a fear to Elfland whither he went. Yet he neither thought to turn back, nor reined for a moment his impatient haste. He said a few formal things of the old man's loss that had happened so long ago. Then, "Where are the elfin mountains?" he asked. "The pale blue peaks?" A look came slowly over the old man's face, as though he had never seen them, as though Alveric, being learned, spoke of something that the old leather worker could not know. No, he did not know, he said. And Alveric found that today, as all those years ago, this old man still refused to speak of Elfland. Well, the boundary was only a few yards away. He would cross it and ask the way of elfin creatures, if he could not see the mountains to guide him then. The old man offered him food, and he had not eaten all day. But Alveric, in his haste, only asked him once more of Elfland, and the old man humbly said that of such things he knew nothing. Then Alveric strode away and came to the field he knew, which he remembered to be divided by the nebulous border of twilight. And indeed, he had no sooner come to the field than he saw all the toadstools leaning over one way, and that the way he was going. For just as thorn trees all lean away from the sea, so toadstools and every plant that has any touch of mystery, such as foxgloves, mulleins, and certain kinds of orchids, when growing anywhere near it, all lean towards Elfland. By this one may know before one has heard a murmur of waves, or before one has guessed an influence of magical things, that one comes, as the case may be, to the sea or the border of Elfland. And in the air above him, Alveric saw golden birds, and guessed that there had been a storm in Elfland, blowing them over the border from the southeast, though the northwest wind blew over the fields we know. And he went on, but the boundary was not there, and he crossed the field as any field we know, and still he had not come to the fells of Elfland. Then Alveric pressed on with a new impatience, with the northwest wind behind him, and the earth began to grow bare and shingly and dull, without flowers, without shade, without colour, with none of those things that there are in remembered lands, by which we build pictures of them when we are there no more. It was all disenchanted now. Alveric saw a golden bird high up, rushing away to the southeast, and he followed his flight, hoping soon to see the mountains of Elfland, which he supposed to be merely concealed by some magical mist. But still the autumnal sky was bright and clear, and all the horizon plain, and still there came never a gleam of the elfin mountains. And not from this did he learn that Elfland had ebbed. But when he saw on that desolate, shingly plain, untorn by the northwest wind but blooming fair in the autumn, a May tree that he remembered a long while since, all white with blossom that once rejoiced a spring day far in his childhood, then he knew that Elfland had been there and must have receded, although he knew not how far. For it is true, and Alveric knew, that just as the glamour that brightens much of our lives especially in early years, comes from rumours that reach us from Elfland by various messengers, on whom be blessings and peace. So there returns from our fields to Elfland again, to become a part of its mystery. All manner of little memories that we have lost, and little devoted toys that were treasured once. And this is part of the law of ebb and flow that science may trace in all things. Thus, light grew the forest of coal, and the coal gives back light. Thus rivers fill the sea, and the sea sends back to the rivers. Thus all things give that receive, even death. Next, Alveric saw lying there on the flat, dry ground a toy that he yet remembered, which years and years ago, how could he say how many, had been a childish joy to him, crudely carved out of wood. And one unlucky day it had been broken, and one unhappy day it had been thrown away. And now he saw it lying there, not merely new and unbroken, but with a wonder about it, a splendour and a romance, the radiant, transfigured thing that his young fancy had known. It lay there, forsaken of Elfland, as wonderful things of the sea lie sometimes desolate on wastes of sand, or when the sea is a far blue bulk with a border of foam. Dreary with lost romance was the plain from which Elfland had gone, though here and there Alveric saw again and again those little forsaken things that had been lost from his childhood, dropping through time to the ageless and hourless region of Elfland to be a part of its glory, and now left forlorn by this immense withdrawal. Old tunes, old songs, old voices, hummed there too, growing fainter and fainter, as though they could not live long in the fields we know. And when the sun set, a mauve rose glow in the east that Alveric fancied a little too gorgeous for earth led him onward still, for he deemed it to be the reflection cast on the sky by the glow of the splendour of Elfland. So he went on hoping to find it, horizon after horizon, and night came on with all earth's comrade stars. And only then Alveric put aside at last that frantic restlessness that had driven him since the morning, and wrapping himself in a loose cloak that he wore, ate such food as he had in a satchel, and slept a troubled sleep, alone with other forsaken things. At the earliest moment of dawn, his impatience awoke him. Although one of October's mists hid all glimpses of light, he ate the last of his food, and then pushed on through the greyness. No sound from the things of our fields came to him now, for men never went that way when Elfland was there, and none but Alveric went now to that desolate plain. He had travelled beyond the sound of cockcrow from the comfortable houses of men, and was now marching through a curious silence, broken only now and then by the small dim cries of the lost songs that had been left by the ebb of Elfland, and were fainter now than they had been the day before. And when dawn shone, Alveric saw again so great a splendour in the sky, glowing all green, low down in the southeast, that he thought once more he saw a reflection from Elfland, and pressed on, hoping to find it over the next horizon. And he passed the next horizon, and still that shingly plain, and never a peak of the pale blue elfin mountains. Whether Elfland always lay over the next horizon, brightening the clouds with its glow, and moved away just as he came, or whether it had gone days or years before, he did not know, but still kept on and on. And he came at last to a dry and grassless ridge, on which his eyes and his hopes had been set for long, and from it he looked far over the desolate flatness that stretched to the rim of the sky. and saw never a sign of Elfland, never a slope of the mountains. Even the little treasures of memory that had been left behind by the ebb were withering into things of our everyday. Then Alveric drew his magical sword from its sheath. But though that sword had power against enchantment, it had not been given the power to bring again an enchantment that was gone, and the desolate land remained the same, for all that he waved his sword, stony, deserted, unromantic and wide. For a little while he went on, but in that flat land the horizon moved imperceptibly with him, and never a peak appeared of the elfin mountains, and on that dreary plain he soon discovered, as sooner or later many a man must, that he had lost Elfland. Chapter 11. The Deep of the Woods. In those days, Zirundarel would amuse the boy by charms and by little wonders, and he was content for a while. And then he began to guess for himself, all in silence, where his mother was. He listened to all things said, and thought long about them. And days passed thus, and he only knew she had gone. And still he said never a word of the thing with which his thoughts were busy. And then he came to know, from things said or unsaid, or from looks or glances or wagging of heads, that there was a wonder about his mother's going. But what the wonder was, he could not find, for all the marvels that crossed his mind when he guessed. And at last, one day, he asked Zirundarel. And stored though her old mind was with ages and ages of wisdom, and though she had feared this question, yet she did not know it had dwelt in his mind for days, and could find no better answer out of her wisdom than that his mother had gone to the woods. When the boy heard this, he determined to go to the woods to find her. Now in his walks abroad with Zirundarel through the little hamlet of Earl, Orion would see the villagers walking by, and the smith at his open forge, and folk in their doorways, and men that came in to the market from distant fields, and he knew them all. And most of all, he knew Threll with his quiet feet, and Oth with his lithe limbs. For both of these would tell him tales when they met of the uplands, and the deep woods over the hill. And Orion, on little journeys with his nurse, loved to hear tales of far places. There was an ancient myrtle tree by a well, where Zirundarel would sit in the summer evenings, while Orion played on the grass. And Oth would cross the grass with his curious bow, going out in the evening. And sometimes Threll would come, and every time that one of them came, Orion would stop him and ask for a tale of the woods. And if it were Oth, he would bow to Zirundarel with a look of awe as he bowed, and would tell some tale of what the deer did, and Orion would ask him why. Then a look would come over Oth's face, as though he were carefully remembering things that had happened very long ago. And after some moments of silence, he would give the ancient cause of whatever the deer did, which explained how they came by the custom. If it were Threll that came across the grass, he would appear not to see Zirundarel, and would tell his tale of the woods more hastily in a low voice, and pass on, leaving the evening, as Orion felt, full of mystery behind him. He would tell tales of all manner of creatures, and the tales were so strange that he told them only to young Orion, because, as he explained, there were many folk that were unable to believe the truth, and he did not wish his tales to come to the ears of such. Once Orion had gone to his house, a dark hut full of skins. All kinds of skins hung on the wall, foxes, badgers and martens, and there were smaller ones in heaps in the corners. To Orion, Threll's dark hut was more full of wonder than any other house he had ever seen. But now it was autumn, and the boy and his nurse saw Oth and Threll more seldom. For in the misty evenings, with the threat of frost in the air, they sat no longer by the myrtle tree. Yet Orion watched on their short walks. And one day he saw Threll going away from the village with his face to the uplands. And he called to Threll, and Threll stood still with a certain air of confusion, for he deemed himself of too little account to be clearly seen and noticed by the nurse at the castle, be she witch or woman. And Orion ran up to him and said, "Show me the woods." And Zirunduril perceived that the time had come when his thoughts were roaming beyond the lip of the valley, and knew that no spell of hers would hold him long from following after them. And Threll said, "No, my master," and looked uneasily at Zirunduril, who came after the boy and led him away from Threll. And Threll went on alone to his work in the deep of the woods. And it was not otherwise than the witch had foreseen. For first Orion wept, and then he dreamed of the woods. And next day he slipped away alone to the house of Oth, and asked him to take him with him when he went to hunt the deer. And Oth, standing on a wide deer skin in front of blazing logs, spoke much of the woods, but did not take him then. Instead, he brought Orion back to the castle. And Zirunduril regretted too late that she had idly said his mother was gone to the woods, for those words of hers had called up too soon that spirit of roving which was bound to come to him. And she saw that her spells could bring content no more. So in the end, she let him go to the woods, but not until by lifting of wand and saying of incantation she had called the glamour of the woods down to the nursery hearth, and had made it haunt the shadows that went from the fire and creep with them all about the room, till the nursery was all as mysterious as the forest. When this spell would not soothe him and keep his longing at home, she let him go to the woods. He stole away once more to the house of Oth, over crisp grass one morning, and the old witch knew he had gone, but did not call him back, for she had no spell to curb the love of roving in man, whether it came early or late, and she would not hold back his limbs when his heart was gone to the woods, for it is ever the way of witches with any two things to care for the more mysterious of the two. So the boy came alone to the house of Oth, through his garden where dead flowers hung on brown stalks, and the petals turned to slime if he fingered them, for November was come, and the frosts were abroad all night. And this time, Orion just met with a mood in Oth, which in less than an hour would have gone, that was favourable to the boy's longing. Oth was taking down his bow from the wall as Orion went in, and Oth's heart was gone to the woods. And when the boy came yearning to go to the woods too, the hunter, in that mood, could not refuse him. So Oth took Orion on his shoulder and went up out of the valley. Folk saw them go thus, Moth with his bow and his soft, noiseless sandals, and his brown garments of leather, Orion on his shoulder, wrapped in the skin of a fawn which Oth had thrown round him. And as the village fell behind them, Orion rejoiced to see the houses further and further away, for he had never been so far from them before. And when the uplands opened their distances to his eyes, he felt that he was now upon no mere walk, but a journey. And then he saw the solemn gloom of the wintry woods far off, and that filled him at once with a delighted awe. To their darkness, their mystery, and their shelter, Oth brought him. So softly, Oth entered the wood that the blackbirds that guarded it, sitting watchful on branches, did not flee at his coming, but only uttered slowly their warning notes, and listened suspiciously till he passed, and were never sure if a man had broken the charm of the wood. Into that charm and the gloom and the deep silence, Oth moved gravely, and a solemnness came on his face as he entered the wood. For to go on quiet feet through the wood was the work of his life, and he came to it as men come to their heart's desire. And soon he put the boy down on the brown bracken and went on for a while alone. Orion watched him go with his bow in his left hand, till he disappeared in the wood, like a shadow going to a gathering of shadows and merging amongst its fellows. And although Orion might not go with him now, he had great joy from this, for he knew by the way Oth went, and the air he had, that this was serious hunting, and no mere amusement made to please a child. And it pleased him more than all the toys he had had. And quiet and lonely, the great wood loomed round him while he waited for Oth to return. And after a long while, he heard a sound, all in the wonder of the wood, that was less loud than the sound that a blackbird made scattering dead leaves to find insects. And Oth had come back again. He had not found a deer, and for a while he sat by Orion and shot arrows into a tree. But soon he gathered his arrows and took the boy on his shoulder again and turned homewards. And there were tears in Orion's eyes when they left the great wood, for he loved the mystery of the huge grey oaks, which we may pass by unnoticed, or with but a momentary feeling of something forgotten, some message not quite given. But to him their spirits were playmates. So he came back to Earl as from new companions, with his mind full of hints that he had from the wise old trunks. For to him each bole had a meaning, and Zirundarel was waiting at the gateway when Oth brought Orion back. And she asked little of his time in the woods, and answered little when he told her of it, for she was jealous of them whose spell had lured him from hers. And all that night his dreams hunted deer in the deeps of the wood. Next day he stole away again to the house of Oth. But Oth was away hunting, for he was in need of meat. So he went to the house of Threll. And there was Threll in his dark house amongst manifold skins. "Take me to the woods," said Orion. And Threll sat down in a wide wooden chair by his fire to think about it and to talk of the woods. He was not like Oth, speaking of a few simple things which he knew, of the deer, of the ways of the deer, and of the approach of the seasons. But he spoke of the things that he guessed in the deep of the wood and in the dark of time, the fables of men and of beasts. And especially he cared to tell the fables of the foxes and badgers, which he had come by from watching their ways at the falling of dusk. And as he sat there gazing into the fire, telling reminiscently of the ancient ways of the dwellers in bracken and bramble, Orion forgot his longing to go to the woods, and sat there on a small chair warm with skins, content. And to Threll he told what he had not said to Oth, how he thought that his mother might come one day round the trunk of one of the oak trees, for she had gone for a while to the woods. And Threll thought that that might be, for there was nothing wonderful told of the woods that Threll thought unlikely. And then Zirundarel came for Orion and took him back to the castle. And the next day she let him go to Oth again. And this time Oth took him once more to the wood. And a few days later he went again to Threll's dark house, in whose cobwebs and corners seemed to lurk the mystery of the forest, and heard Threll's curious tales. And the branches of the forest grew black and still against the blaze of fierce sunsets, and winter began to lay its spell on the uplands, and the wiser ones of the village prophesied snow. And one day Orion, out in the woods with Oth, saw the hunter shoot a stag. He watched him prepare it and skin it and cut it into 2 pieces and tie them up in the skin, with the head and horns hanging down. Then Moth fastened up the horns to the rest of the bundle and heaved it onto his shoulder, and with his great strength carried it home. And the boy rejoiced more than the hunter. And that evening, Orion went to tell the story to Threll, but Threll had more wonderful stories. And so the days went by, while Orion drew from the forest and from the tales of Threll a love of all things that pertain to a hunter's calling, and a spirit grew in him that was well matched with the name he bore, and nothing showed in him yet of the magical part of his lineage. Chapter 12. The Unenchanted Plain. When Alveric understood that he had lost Elfland, it was already evening, and he had been gone 2 days and a night from Earl. For the second time, he lay down for the night on that shingly plain, whence Elfland had ebbed away, and at sunset, the eastern horizon showed clear against turquoise sky, all black and jagged with rocks, without any sign of Elfland, and the twilight glimmered, but it was Earth's twilight, and not that dense barrier for which Alveric looked, which lies between Elfland and Earth. And the stars came out, and were the stars we know, and Alveric slept below their familiar constellations. He awoke in the birdless dawn very cold, hearing old voices crying faintly far off as they slowly drifted away, like dreams going back to dreamland. He wondered if they would come to Elfland again, or if Elfland had ebbed too far. He searched all the horizon eastwards, and still saw nothing but the rocks of that desolate land. So he turned again toward the fields we know. He walked back through the cold with all his impatience gone, and gradually some warmth came to him from walking, and later a little from the autumnal sun. He walked all day, and the sun was growing huge and red when he came again to the leather worker's cottage. He asked for food, and the old man made him welcome. His pot was already simmering for his own evening meal, and it was not long before Alveric was sitting at the old table before a dish full of squirrels' legs, hedgehogs and rabbits' meat. The old man would not eat till Alveric had eaten, but waited on him with such solicitude that Alveric felt that the moment of his opportunity was come, and turned to the old man as he offered him a piece of the back of a rabbit, and approached the subject of Elfland. "The twilight is further away," said Alveric. "Yes, yes," said the old man without any meaning in his voice, whatever he had in his mind. "When did it go?" said Alveric. "The twilight, master," said his host. "Yes," said Alveric. "Ah, the twilight," the old man said. "The barrier," said Alveric, and he lowered his voice, although he knew not why, between here and Elfland. At the word Elfland, all comprehension faded out of the old man's eyes. "Ah," he said. "Old man," said Alveric, "you know where Elfland has gone." "Gone?" said the old man. That innocent surprise, thought Alveric, must be real, but at least he knew where it had been. It used to be only 2 fields away from his door. "Elfland was in the next field once," said Alveric, and the old man's eyes roved back into the past, and he gazed as it. "We're on old days a while." Then he shook his head, and Alveric fixed him with his eye. "You knew Elfland," he exclaimed. Still, the old man did not answer. "You knew where the border was," said Alveric. "I am old," said the leather worker, "and I have no one to ask." When he said that, Alveric knew that he was thinking of his old wife, and he knew too that had she been alive and standing there at that moment, yet he would have had no news of Elfland. There seemed little more to say, but a certain petulance held him to the subject after he knew it to be hopeless. "Who lives to the east of here?" he said. "To the east?" the old man replied. "Master, are there not north and south and west that you needs must look to the east?" There was a look of entreaty in his face, but Alveric did not heed it. "Who lives to the east?" he said. "Master, no one lives to the east," he answered. And that indeed was true. "What used to be there?" said Alveric. And the old man turned away to see to the stewing of his pot, and muttered as he turned, so that one hardly heard him. "The past," he said. No more would the old man say, nor explain what he had said. So Alveric asked him if he could have a bed for the night, and his host showed him the old bed he remembered across that vague number of years. And Alveric accepted the bed without more ado, so as to let the old man go to his own supper. And very soon, Alveric was deep asleep, warm and resting at last, while his host turned over slowly, in his mind many things of which Alveric had supposed he knew nothing. When the birds of our fields woke Alveric, singing late in the last of October, on a morning that reminded them of spring, he rose and went out of doors, and went to the highest part of the little field that lay on the windowless side of the old man's house, toward Elfland. There he looked eastward, and saw all the way to the curved line of the sky, the same barren, desolate, rocky plain that had been there yesterday and the day before. Then the leather worker gave him breakfast, and afterwards he went out and looked again at the plain. And over his dinner, which his host timidly shared, Alveric neared once more the subject of Elfland, and something in the old man's sayings or silences made Alveric hopeful that even yet he would have some news of the whereabouts of the pale blue elfin mountains. So he brought the old man out and turned to the east, to which his companion looked with reluctant eyes, and pointing to one particular rock, the most noticeable and near, said, hoping for definite news of a definite thing, "How long has that rock been there?" And the answer came to his hopes like hail to apple blossom. "It is there, and we must make the best of it." The unexpectedness of the answer dazed Alveric, and when he saw that reasonable questions about definite things brought him no logical answer, he despaired of getting practical information to guide his fantastic journey. So he walked on the eastward side of the cottage all the afternoon, watching the dreary plain, and it never changed or moved. No pale blue mountains appeared, no Elfland came flooding back, and evening came, and the rocks glowed dully with the low rays of the sun, and darkened when it set, changing with all earth's changes, but with no enchantment of Elfland. Then Alveric decided on a great journey. He returned to the cottage and told the leather worker that he needed to buy much provisions, as much as he could carry. And over supper, they planned what he should have. And the old man promised to go next day amongst the neighbours, telling of all the things he would get from each, and somewhat more if God should prosper his snaring. For Alveric had determined to travel eastward till he found the lost land, and Alveric slept early and slept long, till the last of his fatigue was gone, which came from his pursuit of Elfland. The old man woke him as he came back from his snaring, and the creatures that he had snared, the old man put in his pot and hung it over his fire, while Alveric ate his breakfast. And all the morning, the leather worker went from house to house amongst his neighbours, dwelling on little farms at the edge of the fields we know. And he got salted meats from some, bread from one, a cheese from another, and came back burdened to his house in time to prepare dinner. And all the provender that burdened the old man, Alveric shouldered in a sack, and some he put in his wallet, and he filled his water bottle, and 2 more, besides that his host had made from large skins. For he had seen no streams at all in the desolate land, and thus equipped, he walked some way from the cottage, and looked again at the land from which Elfland had ebbed. He came back satisfied that he could carry provisions for a fortnight, and in the evening, while the old man prepared pieces of squirrel's meat, Alveric stood again on the windowless side of the cottage, gazing still across the lonely land, hoping always to see emerge from the clouds that were colouring at sunset those serene pale blue mountains, and seeing never a peak. And the sun set, and that was the last of October. Next morning, Alveric made a good meal in the cottage, then took his heavy burden of provisions, and paid his host, and started. The door of the cottage opened toward the west, and the old man cordially saw him away from his door with Godspeed and farewells. But he would not move round his house to watch him going eastward, nor would he speak of that journey. It was as though to him there were only 3 points of the compass. The bright autumnal sun was not yet high when Alveric went from the fields we know to the land that Elfland had left, and that nothing else went near, with his big sack over his shoulder and his sword at his side. The May trees of memory that he had seen were all withered now, and the old songs and voices that had haunted that land were all now faint as sighs, and there seemed to be fewer of them, as though some had already died, or had struggled back to Elfland. All that day, Alveric travelled with the vigour that waits at the beginning of journeys, which helped him on, though he was burdened with so much provisions, and a big blanket that he wore like a heavy cloak round his shoulders, and he carried besides a bundle of firewood and a stave in his right hand. He was an incongruous figure, with his stave and his sack and his sword, but he followed one idea, one inspiration, one hope, and so shared something of the strangeness that all men have who do this. Halting at noon to eat and rest, he went slowly on again and walked till evening. Even then, he did not rest as he had intended, for when twilight fell and lay heavy along the eastern sky, he continually rose from his resting and went a little further to see if it might not be that dense, deep twilight that made the frontier of the fields we know, shutting them off from Elfland. But it was always earthly twilight, until the stars came out, and they were all the familiar stars that look on earth. Then he lay down among those unrounded and mossless rocks, and ate bread and cheese, and drank water. And as the cold of night began to come over the plain, he lit a small fire with his scanty bundle of wood, and lay close to it, with his cloak and his blanket round him. And before the embers were black, he was sound asleep. Dawn came without sound of bird or whisper of leaves or grasses. Dawn came in dead silence and cold, and nothing on all that plain gave a welcome back to the light. If darkness had lain forever upon those angular rocks, it were better, Alveric thought, as he saw their shapeless companies sullenly glowing. Darkness were better, now that Elfland was gone. And though the misery of that disenchanted place entered his spirit with the chill of the dawn, yet his fiery hope still shone. and gave him little time to eat by the cold black circle of his lonely fire, before it hurried him onward, easterly over the rocks. And all that morning he travelled on without the comradeship of a blade of grass. The golden birds that he had seen before had long since fled back to Elfland, and the birds of our fields and all living things we know shunned all that empty waste. Alveric travelled as much alone as a man who goes back in memory to revisit remembered scenes. And instead of remembered scenes, he was in a place from which every glamour had gone. He travelled somewhat lighter than on the day before, but he went more wearily, for he felt more heavily now the fatigue of the previous day. He rested long at midday and then went on. The myriad rocks stretched on and slightly jagged the horizon, and all day there came no glimpse of the pale blue mountains. That evening, from his dwindling provision of wood, Alveric made another fire. Its little flame going up alone in that waste seemed somehow to reveal the monstrous loneliness. He sat by his fire and thought of Lyrazel, and would not give up hope, though a glance at those rocks might have warned him not to hope, for something in their chaotic look partook of the plane that bred them, and they hinted it to be infinite. Chapter 13. The reticence of the leather worker. It was many days before Alveric learned from the monotony of the rocks that one day's journey was the same as another, and that by no number of journeys would he bring any change to his rugged horizons, which were all drearily like the ones they replaced, and never brought a view of the pale blue mountains. He had gone, while his fortnight's provisions grew lighter and lighter, for 10 days over the rocks. It was now evening, and Alveric understood at last that if he travelled further, and failed soon to see the peaks of the Elfin mountains, he would starve. So he ate his supper, sparingly in the darkness, his bundle of firewood having long since been used, and abandoned the hope that had led him. And as soon as there was any light at all to show him where the east was, he ate a little of what he had saved from his supper, and started his long tramp back to the fields of men, over rocks that seemed all the harsher because his back was to Elfland. All that day he ate and drank little, and by nightfall he still had left full provisions for 4 more days. He had hoped to travel faster during these last days, if he should have, to turn back because he would travel lighter. He had given no thought to the power of those monotonous rocks, to weary and to depress with their desolation, when the hope that had somewhat illumined their grimness was gone. He had thought little of turning back at all, till the 10th evening came, and no pale blue mountains, and he suddenly looked at his provisions, and all the monotony of his homeward journey was broken only by occasional fears that he might not be able to come to the fields we know. The myriad rocks lay larger and thicker than tombstones, and not so carefully shaped, yet the waste had the look of a graveyard stretching over the world, with unrecording stones above nameless heads. Chilled by the bitter nights, guided by blazing sunsets, he went on through the morning mists and the empty noons and weary, birdless evenings. More than a week went by since he had turned, and the last of his water was gone, and still he saw no sign of the fields we know, or anything more familiar than rocks that he seemed to remember, and which would have misled him northward, southward, or eastward, were it not for the red November sun that he followed, and sometimes some friendly star. And then, at last, just as the darkness fell blackening that rocky multitude, there showed westward over the rocks, pale at first against remnants of sunset, but growing more and more orange window under one of the gables of Man. Alveric rose and walked towards it till the rocks in the darkness and weariness overcame him, and he lay down and slept. And the little yellow window shone into his dreams and made forms of hope as fair as any that came from Elfland. The house that he saw in the morning when he woke seemed impossible to be the one whose tiny light had held out hope and helped to him in the loneliness. It seemed now too plain and common. He recognized it for a house not far from the one of the leather worker. Soon he came to a pool and drank. He came to a garden in which a woman was working early, and she asked him whence he had come. From the east, he said, and pointed, and she did not understand. And so he came again to the cottage from which he had started, to ask once more for hospitality from the old man who had housed him twice. He was standing in his doorway as Alveric came, walking wearily, and again he made him welcome. He gave him milk and then food, and Alveric ate, and then rested all the day. It was not till evening he spoke. But when he had eaten and rested, and he was at the table again, and supper was now before him, and there was light and warmth, he felt all at once the need of human speech. And then he poured out the story of that great journey over the land where the things of man ceased, and where yet no birds or little beasts had come, or even flowers, a chronicle of desolation. And the old man listened to the vivid words and said nothing, making some comments of his own, only when Alveric spoke of the fields we know. He heard with politeness, but said never a word of the land from which Elfland had ebbed. It was indeed as though all the land to the east were delusion, and as though Alveric had been restored from it, or had awoken from dream, and were now among reasonably daily things, and there was nothing to say of the things of dream. Certainly, never a word would the old man say in recognition of Elfland, or of anything 80 yards east of his cottage door. Then Alveric went to his bed, and the old man sat alone till his fire was low, thinking of what he had heard, and shaking his head. And all the next day, Alveric rested there, or walked in the old man's autumn-smitten garden, and sometimes he tried again to speak with his host of his great journey in the desolate land, but got from him no admission that such lands were, checked always by his avoidance of the topic, as though to speak of these lands might bring them nearer. And Alveric pondered on many reasons for this. Had the old man been to Elfland in his youth and seen something he greatly feared, perhaps barely escaping from death or an age-long love? Was Elfland a mystery, too great to be troubled by human voices? Did these folk dwelling there at the edge of our world know well the unearthly beauty of all the glories of Elfland, and fear that even to speak of them might be a lure to draw them, whither their resolution, barely perhaps, held them back? Or might a word said of the magical land bring it nearer, to make fantastic and elvish the fields we know? To all these ponderings of Alveric there was no answer. And yet, one more day, Alveric rested, and after that, he set out to return to Earl. He set out in the morning, and his host came with him out of his doorway, saying farewell, and speaking of his journey home, and of the affairs of Earl, which were food for gossip over many farmlands. And great was the contrast between the good man's approval that he showed thus for the fields we know, over which Alveric journeyed now, and his disapproval for those other lands whither Alveric's hopes still turned. And they parted, and the old man's farewells dwindled, and then he turned back into his house, rubbing his hands contentedly as he slowly went, for he was glad to see one who had looked toward the fantastic lands turned now to a journey across the fields we know. In those fields, the frost was master, and Alveric walked over the crisp grey grass and breathed the clear, fresh air, thinking little of his home or his son, but planning how, even yet, he might come to Elfland, for he thought that further north there might be a way, coming round perhaps behind the pale blue mountains, that Elfland had ebbed too far for him to overtake it there. He felt despairingly sure, but scarcely believed it had gone along the entire frontier of twilight, where Elfland touches earth as far as poet has sung. Further north, he might find the frontier, unmoved, lying sleepy with twilight, and come under the pale blue mountains and see his wife again. Full of these thoughts, he went over the misty, mellow fields, and full of his dreams and plans about that phantasmal land, he came in the afternoon to the woods that brood above Earl. He entered the wood, and deep though he was amongst thoughts that were far from there, he soon saw the smoke of a fire a little way off, rising grey among the dark oak boles. He went towards it to see who was there, and there were his son and Zerundaril warming their hands at the fire. "Where have you been?" called Orion as soon as he saw him. "Upon a journey," said Alveric. "Moth is hunting," Orion said, and he pointed in the direction whence the wind was fanning the smoke. And Zerundaril said nothing, for she saw more in Alveric's eyes than any questions of hers would have drawn from his tongue. Then Orion showed him a deer skin on which he was sitting. "Moth shot it," he said. There seemed to be a magic all round that fire of big logs quietly smouldering in the woods upon autumn's discarded robe that lay brilliant there. And it was not the magic of Elfland, nor had Zerundaril called it up with her wand. It was only a magic of the wood's very own. And Alveric stood there for a while in silence, watching the boy and the witch by their fire in the woods, and understanding that the time was come when he must tell Orion things that were not clear to himself and that were puzzling him even now. Yet he did not speak of them then, but saying something of the affairs of Earl, turned and walked on toward his castle, while Zerundaril and the boy came back later with Moth. And Alveric commanded supper when he came to his gateway, and ate it alone in the great hall that there was in the castle of Earl. And all the while he was pondering words to say. And then he went in the evening up to the nursery and told the boy how his mother was gone for a while to Elfland, to her father's palace, which may only be told of in song. And, unheeding any words of Orion then, he held on with the brief tale that he had come to tell, and told how Elfland was gone. "But that cannot be," said Orion, "for I hear the horns of Elfland every day." "You can hear them," Alveric said, and the boy replied, "I hear them blowing at evening." That is the end of tonight's reading. The years have passed without magic in them. Alveric has grieved and waited and decided. He will go east again. He will find the border. He will find Elfland, wherever it has gone, however far it has retreated, and he will not stop until he does. And somewhere to the east, barely visible on the horizon, to a shepherd who happened to be looking at the right moment, the pale blue mountains, still there, still retreating. Orion is growing up. He has the look of Elfland about him, and there is a horn, somewhere in the valley, that was old before anyone can remember, and it is waiting for the right hands to lift it. Episode 5. The Unicorn in the Starlight. Moth is asleep. You can be too. Music is by Velikor Dark Academia.